For more than 40 years after humanity first reached the stars, Earth remained a puzzle no one in the galaxy bothered to solve. It began quietly, as most historic things do. In the year 2187, a small ship built by hands that had once only known the soil of one world pushed past the edge of its own solar system. It moved slowly by galactic standards, its engines humming with a technology others had mastered centuries earlier. But it moved, and it carried a message not of conquest or demand, but of simple greeting. We are here. We are learning. We wish to understand. The message was received. Polite replies came back. Invitations followed. The Galactic Concord, a gathering of 17 species who had long since grown comfortable with one another's ways, extended a formal welcome. They asked Earth to send representatives to their next summit on the neutral world of Xylos Prime. It was a routine gesture, the kind offered to any new voice in the dark. Earth did not go dot at first. The absence was noted with mild curiosity. Perhaps their ship had been a one-time effort. Perhaps internal conflicts had pulled their attention back inward. The Concorde sent another invitation 2 years later. Again, silence. A third invitation came with gentle concern. Was Earth facing difficulties? Did they require assistance? The reply, when it finally arrived months later, was brief and courteous. Thank you for the invitation. We are not ready. That phrase, repeated over the decades, became Earth's signature. Not ready. Not yet. Soon, perhaps. To the older civilizations of the Concorde, this made a kind of sense. They had all passed through phases of immaturity. They remembered their own centuries of war, of fractured nations, of struggling to unite under a single identity. They assumed humanity was simply taking longer. They watched Earth's broadcast fragmented news feeds, entertainment signals, scientific journals leaking into space, and saw what they expected to see. A species still arguing with itself, still learning to share a single world before daring to claim a place among many by the 2240s. Earth's name was no longer spoken with curiosity, but with quiet dismissal. At summit dinners, diplomats would sometimes joke about the quiet planet near the Orion Arm. They'd wonder aloud if humans had given up on the stars, retreating back to their oceans and mountains. Some suggested Earth might be ecologically fragile, too delicate to survive spacefaring life. Others whispered that humanity's biology made them unstable, too emotional, too quick to anger. None of these guesses were made with malice. That was the hardest part. The galaxy wasn't hostile toward Earth. It had simply decided Earth didn't matter enough to think about much at all. What the galaxy did not see were the changes happening quietly, deliberately beneath Earth's atmosphere and beyond it. While alien diplomats debated trade routes and cultural exchanges on Xylos Prime, human engineers worked in shipyards hidden in the shadow of Jupiter's moons. While galactic scholars published papers on Earth's developmental delay, human teachers in classrooms from Buenos Aires to Jakarta taught children that patience was a form of strength. That watching carefully was smarter than rushing in unprepared. There were moments of frustration, of course. Young diplomats fresh from training would argue that Earth should respond, should prove itself, should send even a single representative just to be seen. But the older leaders, the ones who remembered the resource wars that had nearly torn the planet apart in the late 22nd century, shook their heads. They had learned a painful lesson. Attention without readiness invites exploitation. They had watched historical records of other young species who had rushed to join the galactic community too soon, only to find their resources claimed, their cultures diluted, their sovereignty quietly erased under the guise of guidance and partnership. So Earth waited, and in that waiting, something unusual happened. Freed from the pressure to perform for an audience, humanity turned its focus inward, not in isolation, but in unity. Nations that had once pointed weapons at one another now shared power grids and water systems. Languages that had divided people for millennia became bridges instead of barriers. The drive to reach the stars didn't disappear. It deepened. It became less about proving something to others and more about building something lasting for themselves. From the outside, this looked like stagnation. Galactic sensors detected no massive fleet construction, no dramatic energy spikes from weapons testing, no bold declarations broadcast across subspace channels. Earth's emissions remained modest, its space presence minimal. To any observer passing through the Sol system, it appeared exactly as the Concorde believed it to be, a young civilization still finding its feet. Still years, perhaps centuries away from true maturity. What those observers missed were the small things. The way Earth's orbital stations grew not taller, but smarter, their structures woven with materials that could heal their own fractures. The way human ships, when they did venture out, moved with an uncanny efficiency, taking routes others considered too risky, arriving at destinations others thought unreachable. They never stayed long. They never announced themselves. They simply came, observed, and left. Like students sitting at the back of a classroom saying nothing, but missing nothing. By the 2320s, Earth had become a ghost in galactic records. Its name appeared only in footnotes. New diplomats joining the Concorde were sometimes tested on obscure trivia. Name 3 non-member systems of cultural interest. Earth might be one answer if the examiner was feeling generous. Otherwise, it was forgotten entirely. This was exactly what Earth's leaders had hoped for. Not to be hated, not to be feared, just to be overlooked. Because while the galaxy looked away, humanity was doing the one thing no one expected: growing up in peace. Learning not just how to build starships, but why. Not just how to wield power, but when to hold it quietly. They were becoming something the galaxy had no category for: a civilization that valued readiness over reputation, substance over spectacle. And so the decades passed. Summits came and went. Earth received its invitations and set them aside. The galaxy moved on. And in the quiet dark around the modest yellow star, something was being built, not with fanfare, but with care. Not for an audience, but for a purpose no outsider could yet imagine. The galaxy thought Earth was silent because it had nothing to say. They would learn. In time, that silence can be the loudest warning of all. While the rest of the galaxy chatted over summit dinners and debated trade tariffs on Xylos Prime, Earth was busy doing something no one expected: building in silence. It wasn't flashy. There were no grand announcements, no victory parades through orbital cities, no live broadcasts of ship launches meant to impress distant eyes. Instead, humanity worked like a family, preparing for a storm they knew was coming, but never spoke about out loud. It started with lessons from the past. The resource wars of the late 22nd century had nearly ended everything. Nations had fought over water, energy, even clean air. Cities burned. Oceans choked. Millions vanished. Out of that pain came a hard truth. Survival wasn't about who shouted the loudest. It was about who planned the smartest. So when the United Earth Directorate finally formed, not as a government of conquest, but as a council of shared survival, they made one rule above all: don't show your hand until you're ready to play. That became the heartbeat of Project Aegis. Not a weapon, not a war plan, just a promise to never again be caught unprepared. At first, it was small. Recycling systems improved so nothing was wasted. Solar collectors stretched across deserts and oceans, feeding power not just to homes, but to hidden research labs buried under ice caps and mountain ranges. Children in schools didn't just learn math and history. They studied engineering, ecology, and ethics together. Because the leaders knew that technology without wisdom was just another kind of fire. Then came the ships, not the sleek, glowing cruisers the galaxy loved to parade. Earth's vessels were built for endurance, not beauty. Hulls were layered with self-repairing alloys grown from asteroid metals. Engines didn't roar, they hummed, using quantum slipstream drives, refined over decades of quiet testing beyond Neptune's orbit. That didn't control the ships. It assisted human crews, trained from youth to think faster than any machine could predict. Every system had backups. Every backup had backups. Because out there, in the cold between stars, failure wasn't an option. It was final. The real secret wasn't the technology. It was the unity. For the first time in human history, every nation, big or small, rich or recovering, shared resources, knowledge, and purpose. Factories in former conflict zones now built life support modules. Former military bases became training centers for deep space navigation. Even artists contributed, designing interfaces that felt intuitive, calming, human. This wasn't about building a fleet to scare anyone. It was about building a future that couldn't be taken away. And they did it all without telling. A soul beyond their own world. Galactic sensors occasionally picked up strange energy signatures near the edge of the solar system. Brief flickers, then gone. Sometimes a passing freighter would report seeing odd lights near Saturn's rings. But without proof, and with Earth's reputation as a quiet backwater, these reports were dismissed as sensor glitches or cosmic dust. No one thought to look closer. Why would they? Earth hadn't even sent a single diplomat to a summit in 50 years. Surely they were still arguing over borders and budgets down on that blue-green marble. But beneath that surface, something extraordinary was growing. In the Kuiper Belt. Far beyond Pluto, massive orbital dry docks floated in perfect darkness. Constructed from recycled space debris and mined comets, they assembled warships not one by one, but in synchronized waves. Robots welded hull plates while human engineers monitored every weld through neural-linked visors. Food was grown in vertical farms inside the docks. Water was pulled from icy moons and purified endlessly. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. What made these ships different wasn't just their firepower, it was their philosophy. Each vessel carried medical bays large enough to treat entire colonies. Storage holds filled not just with weapons, but with seeds, soil samples, and cultural archives. The idea wasn't to dominate, but to protect, and if needed, to rebuild. Because Earth remembered what it was like to lose everything. They wouldn't let that happen again. Not to themselves. And not to others. If they ever had the chance to help by the 2340s, the fleet was ready. Not just one ship. Not 10, 1,000. Each one capable of independent operation, yet linked through a silent network that allowed them to move as one mind. They practiced maneuvers in the void between stars, vanishing into gravitational shadows, emerging only when they chose to. Pilots trained not just in combat, but in diplomacy, medicine, and crisis response. They weren't soldiers. They were guardians. And they waited back on Earth. Life went on as usual. Markets bustled. Children played in parks. Farmers harvested crops under open skies. To anyone watching from afar, nothing had changed. That was the genius of it. The strength wasn't in showing off. It was in staying unseen until the moment truly mattered. People often wonder how a whole planet kept such a secret. The answer is simple. They didn't see it as a secret. They saw it as responsibility. Parents told their kids bedtime stories, not about heroes winning battles, but about communities working together to survive the night. Teachers reminded students that true courage wasn't charging forward. It was standing firm when no one was watching. And leaders, elected not for charisma but for character, made sure every decision served the long view. Not the next headline. So while the galaxy assumed Earth was stuck in its adolescence, Humanity was quietly graduating into something new. Not just a spacefaring civilization, but a mature one that understood power isn't about noise, but about choice. About knowing when to speak, and when to stay silent, and they would stay silent, until the day the galaxy stopped seeing them as harmless, and started treating them as disposable. That day was coming, and Earth was ready. The message arrived on a Tuesday, not with sirens or emergency alerts, but as a routine data packet intercepted by deep space monitoring stations orbiting Neptune. At first, no one thought much of it. Earth's listening posts captured thousands of alien transmissions, daily trade negotiations, scientific exchanges, even what seemed like galactic gossip. Most were archived and forgotten. But this one was different. It carried the official seal of the Galactic Concord. Inside the secure briefing rooms beneath Geneva, translation algorithms worked quickly. The words appeared on screens in plain language. And as the delegates read, the air in the room grew heavy. The Concord was holding its 41st summit, a familiar ritual. But this time, Earth's name had been spoken not with curiosity, but with casual disregard. A species called the Zentauri had proposed a motion. They spoke of the Cathar hegemony, a growing threat on the galaxy's edge. Resources were needed. Ships, materials, energy. And so the Zentauri suggested tapping underutilized systems, worlds that contributed little but occupied useful space. They named several. Then they reached Sol. They described Earth as non-participatory, technologically stagnant, politically fragmented. They suggested the system's mineral-rich asteroids and moons be designated for managed extraction. The motion passed with little debate. A formality, really. Why would anyone object to harvesting resources from a world that had never even bothered to show up? For a long moment, no one in the briefing room spoke. Then a young analyst, her voice barely above a whisper, said what everyone was thinking. They're going to take our home, and they don't even think we'll notice. That was the true sting of it. Not the threat itself, but the assumption behind it. The galaxy hadn't declared war on Earth, and hadn't even seen Earth as worth threatening. They had simply decided humanity didn't matter enough to consult. Like deciding to cut down a tree in an empty field. Why ask permission from the wind? Across Earth, the news spread quietly. Not through public broadcasts that would have caused panic, but through secure channels to leaders, engineers, shipyard commanders. In orbital habitats above the Pacific, workers paused during meal breaks, faces grim as they read the translated transcript on private tablets. In underground farms beneath the Sahara, farmers working night shifts exchanged glances that said everything without words. This wasn't an attack. It was something worse, erasure. The quiet removal of a people who had been deemed irrelevant. That evening, the United Earth Directorate convened its highest council. No grand chamber. No dramatic lighting. Just a circular room with simple chairs and a large window showing Earth turning slowly below. View available only to those who had earned the right to see it. The debate began not with anger, but with sorrow. One elder, her hands worn from decades of rebuilding coastal cities after the floods, spoke first. We waited this long to avoid exactly this moment. To prove we could be patient. To show that silence wasn't weakness. She looked around the table. And for what? So they could decide our fate while sipping drinks on some neutral world? Another voice, younger, sharper. We have the fleet. We've had it for years. One signal and 1,000 ships emerged from the dark. They'd reconsider their motion quickly enough. But a third speaker, a former teacher who had helped design Earth's unified education system, shook his head. And then what? They see our weapons and call us aggressive. They see our silence as deception. Either way, we become the threat they always assumed we'd be. He leaned forward. This was never about hiding our strength. It was about preserving our choice. The choice of when to speak, when to act. That choice is all we have left. Outside the council chamber, ordinary people went about their lives unaware. Children did homework. Couples walked along rivers. Night shift workers brewed coffee in quiet factories. None of them knew that a decision made tonight would echo across centuries. But that was the burden of leadership, to carry weight others never feel, so they can keep living lightly. As Earth rotated through another dawn, the council reached its decision. Not quickly, not easily, but with a clarity that comes only after staring directly at a hard truth. They would not attack. They would not threaten. They would not even send a protest message. That would be just another form of begging for attention. Instead, they would show up not as petitioners, not as victims, but as equals. At the next summit, the very gathering that had dismissed them, they would arrive not with words, but with presence. 1,000 ships, silent, uninvited, unignorable, not to fight, simply to stand there and say, without firing a shot, we are here. And we decide what happens to our home. The order went out that night. Not as a battle command, but as a quiet shift in posture. Ship commanders received new coordinates. Engineers ran final diagnostics on engines that had never been pushed to their limits. Pilots reviewed approach patterns for Xylos Prime, not as invaders, but as guests who had chosen their own invitation. In the days that followed, something subtle changed across Earth, not in policy or daily life, but in atmosphere. People sensed it without knowing why. A straightening of shoulders in crowded transit stations. A little more care taken with a craftsperson's work. A parent holding a child's hand a moment longer while looking up at the stars. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. The kind that comes when a community realizes it must finally step onto a stage. It never asked to join, but can no longer avoid. Some worried. What if the Concorde saw the fleet as aggression? What if they opened fire first? But the Council had studied galactic history carefully. They knew older civilizations valued strength when paired with restraint. 1,000 silent ships carried more message than a single fired weapon ever could. The goal wasn't to win a battle, it was to win respect. To replace pity with pause. Dismissal with dignity. The final preparations happened without fanfare. No parades. No speeches. Just people doing their jobs with a quiet intensity that needed no explanation. In shipyards hidden behind Jupiter's swirling clouds, crews ran final checks on hull integrity. In communication centers buried under Antarctic ice, linguists refined translations, not of threats, but of simple, clear statements. We come in peace. We ask only to be seen. And beneath it all ran a current of something rarely felt in human history. Unity without force. Not because a government demanded it, but because millions of individuals, spread across continents and cultures, had arrived at the same understanding on their own. This wasn't about pride. It was about principle. About the right of any people to determine their own future. The galaxy had made its assumption. Earth would now offer a correction, not with anger, not with violence, but with presence. 1,000 ships. One choice. And the quiet certainty that sometimes the most powerful thing a person or a planet can do is simply show up. The morning of the summit's final day dawned peacefully over Xylos Prime. Twin suns cast soft gold light across the floating gardens where diplomats strolled between sessions. Laughter drifted from open-air cafes where representatives shared stories and mild stimulants. No one expected disruption. The agenda was like closing remarks, ceremonial exchanges, plans for the next gathering in 2 years. It was meant to be a gentle conclusion to another routine cycle of galactic diplomacy. Then the alarms began. At first, They were faint, barely more than whispers in the monitoring stations orbiting the planet. Sensor operators blinked at their screens, assuming glitches. Energy signatures that large couldn't appear without warning. Slipstream exits created ripples hours in advance. Yet these ships, they simply were. One moment, empty space. The next, 1,000 dark shapes hanging in perfect formation against the starfield. Panic moved through the orbital station, like a sudden chill. Alarms shifted from curious beeps to urgent blares. Diplomats froze mid-sentence. Waiters dropped trays. Across the station's vast observation decks, beings of every shape and size turned toward the viewports and fell silent. There, filling the sky, hung Earth's fleet. The ships were unlike anything the Concorde had seen. Not sleek or ornate like Zentari vessels, not glowing with soft light like the luminized sacred cruisers. These were functional, purposeful. Hulls the color of deep space, marked only by faint running lights along their edges. No weapons visible. No aggressive posturing. They simply occupied the space around Xylos Prime with a quiet certainty that needed no explanation. Inside the main council chamber, chaos erupted. The Zentari delegate demanded immediate military response. Others shouted for communication channels to be opened. A few species, the older, wiser ones, simply watched, their many eyes reflecting something close to awe. Because what struck everyone wasn't the threat of violence. It was the silence. 1,000 warships, capable of unimaginable destruction, had arrived without firing a single shot, without broadcasting a single threat. They had chosen restraint when they could have, chosen dominance. Then the message came. It wasn't a blast of noise or a demand for surrender. It flowed gently across every open channel in a dozen languages, spoken in calm, measured tones by human voices. This is Earth. We request observer status at the Galactic Summit. That was all. On the station's main viewport, a single ship detached from the formation and glided forward, not aggressively, but with the grace of a dancer entering a room. It stopped at a respectful distance from the station's docking bays. No weapons charged. No shields flared. Just a vessel, alone now, waiting. Inside Earth's lead ship, the atmosphere was nothing like the panic gripping the station. The bridge was quiet. Crew members moved with practiced calm, hands resting lightly on controls. They had trained for this moment for years, not for battle, but for presence. Their mission wasn't to intimidate. It was to be seen. To stand in the room after being ignored for decades and simply say, "We belong here too." When the human delegate finally stepped onto the station's main concourse, all conversation stopped. They wore simple clothing, dark fabric, minimal decoration. No armor, no weapons. Just a person walking calmly toward the council chamber, surrounded by beings twice their height or half their size. Some diplomats stared with hostility, others with curiosity. A few, particularly the younger representatives from smaller species, watched with something like hope. The Zentari arbiter was the first to speak, voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "You violate sacred protocol. You arrive uninvited with weapons aimed at a peaceful gathering. Explain yourselves before we treat this as an act of war." The human delegate stopped, looked around the room not with fear, but with quiet assessment. Then they spoke, voice clear but not loud. "We aimed no weapons. We fired no shots. We traveled across light years not to threaten you, but to answer a question you asked about our world without asking us." A pause. The weight of those words settled over the chamber. "You decided our resources were yours to take because we never came to your table. But absence isn't consent. Silence isn't surrender. We chose to listen before we spoke, to learn before we acted. And we learned enough to know when our home was being given away." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The Lumini Elder, ancient and soft-glowing, raised a delicate limb. Why wait so long? Why not join us decades ago when first invited? Because we weren't ready, the human replied simply. Not technologically. Not united. We had to heal our own world before we could stand beside others. And we had to be certain that when we finally arrived, it would be on our terms, not as students needing guidance, but as equals offering partnership. Then came the moment that changed everything. The human turned toward the main viewport, where the 1,000 ships still hung in silent formation. Those vessels carry weapons, yes, but they also carry medical supplies enough to heal entire colonies, seeds to restart dead worlds, archives of every culture that ever flourished on our planet. We built them not to take, but to protect. Not just ourselves. Anyone who needs it. They turned back to the council. We didn't come here to fight. We came here to be seen. To remind you that strength isn't about how loudly you speak. It's about knowing when to stay quiet, and when silence has served its purpose. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the Lumini Elder bowed slowly, a gesture of deep respect rarely given to newcomers. One by one, other delegates followed. Not all. The Zinthari remained stiff, pride wounded. But enough. Enough to shift the room's energy from fear to something fragile, but real. Respect. Outside, the fleet remained motionless against the stars. No celebration. No victory signals. Just presence. A quiet demonstration that the galaxy had been wrong about Earth. Not because humanity was weak, but because they had misunderstood the nature of strength itself. And in that moment, as sunlight from twin suns glinted off 1,000 silent halls, the galaxy learned something new. That the most powerful arrival isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the one that arrives after being forgotten, and changes everything without firing a single shot. The change did not happen all at once. Real change never does. It arrived like the first light of dawn, soft at first, barely noticeable, then slowly filling every corner until the world looked different without anyone being able to say exactly what had happened. In the weeks after Earth's fleet appeared above Xylos Prime, the galaxy held its breath. Many expected retaliation. Others braced for demands. War preparations quietly began on several worlds. But Earth did none of those things. The 1,000 ships remained in formation, silent and still. No weapons charged. No threats issued. They simply stayed present, patient. Undeniable. The first real shift came when the mineral reclamation order was quietly withdrawn. Not with fanfare or apology, but with a simple update to the Concord's resource registry. Sol system. Status changed from available for managed extraction to sovereign territory, non-negotiable. The Zinthari delegation protested. Of course. But their arguments rang hollow now. How you claim resources from a world that arrived with 1,000 warships and chose not to use them? The math was simple, and the galaxy understood it perfectly. Within months, Earth was granted full membership in the Concord. Not probationary status. Not observer rights. Full standing, with all privileges, including veto power on matters affecting planetary sovereignty. The human delegate who accepted the position did so without celebration. There were no victory speeches, just a quiet acknowledgement. We accept this not as a prize, but as a responsibility. To speak not just for ourselves, but for any voice that has been overlooked. And that became Earth's unexpected gift to the galaxy. It wasn't the fleet that was just the attention getter. The real change was in perspective. For centuries, the Concord had operated on a simple hierarchy. Old species at the top, young species learning at the edges, silent worlds forgotten entirely. Earth's arrival cracked that system open. Within a year, Three smaller species that had attended summits for decades without ever being truly heard suddenly found their proposals receiving serious consideration. They had watched Earth's example. They had learned that patience paired with preparation could shift power without violence. Back on Earth, life continued much as before. Markets still bustled. Children still played in parks under open skies. But something had shifted in the air, a quiet pride that needed no shouting. People didn't celebrate with parades or monuments. Instead, they gathered in smaller ways. Neighbors shared meals on rooftops while glancing up at the stars, knowing their world was finally seen. Teachers told students the old stories, not of conquest, but of waiting. Of building quietly while others weren't looking. Of choosing dignity over drama. The fleet never fired a single shot. That fact became legend. Historians would later call it the Silent Reckoning, not because Earth had punished anyone, but because the galaxy had been forced to reckon with its own assumptions. The quiet planet they dismissed for decades had been watching, learning, preparing, and when the moment came, humanity had responded not with anger, but with grace. That was the lesson that stuck. True strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you choose not to. Years passed. Earth's delegates became known for speaking rarely but meaningfully. They never dominated conversations. They listened more than they talked. When they did speak, others leaned in not out of fear, but respect. They brought perspectives no one else had. The wisdom of a species that had nearly destroyed itself, then chose to rebuild together. The patience of a people who understood that some victories take generations. The humility of those who knew their place in the cosmos was small, but their choices still mattered. Other species began visiting Earth not for resources or technology, but for something harder to define. They came to see how a world that had once been fractured by war had learned to share water, power, even language. They walked through cities where ancient temples stood beside modern hospitals, where children learned 5 languages not for commerce, but for connection. They saw parks grown over old battlefields. They tasted food made from recipes passed down through families who had once been enemies. And they began to understand why Earth had waited so long before stepping onto the galactic stage. You cannot offer unity to others until you have built it within yourself. The 1,000 warships eventually returned to the Sol system. Not in a dramatic departure, but gradually some staying on patrol, others returning to hidden shipyards for maintenance, a few remaining near Xylos Prime as Earth's permanent diplomatic presence. Their work was done. They had made their point without bloodshed, and in doing so, they had redefined what power could look like. Today, decades later, new diplomats joining the Concord still hear the story. It's taught not as a military lesson, but as a philosophical one. The instructor, a wizened being from a species that has seen empires rise and fall, always ends the lesson the same way. Earth taught us that the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a bomb. It is being underestimated. And the most powerful response to dismissal is not anger, it is quiet, undeniable presence. On Earth itself, the story lives on in quieter ways. Grandparents tell grandchildren about the time their world was ignored, and how their great-grandparents chose to build rather than complain. Artists paint the fleet not as weapons of war, but as a constellation of hope against the stars. Musicians compose pieces that begin in near silence, then slowly build into something vast and beautiful, just like the journey. Humanity took the galaxy, never again made the mistake of overlooking Earth. But more importantly, Earth never made the mistake of becoming what it had opposed. It did not grow arrogant with its new standing. It did not build more weapons or seek to dominate others. It simply took its seat at the table calmly, thoughtfully, ready to listen as much as to speak. And sometimes, on clear nights, people on Earth still look up at the stars and remember. They remember the decades of silence, the careful work done in shadow, The moment their world finally stepped into the light, not with a shout, but with a presence so steady it could not be ignored. They remember that being seen isn't about making noise. It's about being real, about showing up as you are, fully prepared, fully human. The galaxy had expected a primitive species still learning to share a single world. Instead, it met a civilization that had already mastered the hardest lesson of all, that true strength lies not in taking what you want, but in protecting what matters and having the patience to wait until the moment is right to stand up and be counted. And in the quiet spaces between stars, where new civilizations are still finding their voices, Earth's story travels like a gentle current. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is the one everyone forgot to watch. The one who used their silence not as weakness, but as preparation. The one who arrived not to conquer, but to belong, and in doing so, changed everything without ever raising a hand in anger. That is the legacy of the 1,000 ships. Not fear, not domination, but respect earned not by force, but by the simple, profound act of showing up when it mattered most.